are now definitely surrounded, and there's reports that they've actually been divided into two pockets. So this is now two cauldrons rather than one big cauldron. Cauldron, just a reminder of viewers, is what the Russians call encirclements. So this force, which is the key strike force of the Ukrainian military. It's got all the best troops, all the best equipment. That's now been encircled, and its situation looks extremely precarious, or at least that's what the reports say. I mean, when we say precarious, it looks terminally precarious. The second is that there's also reports from Mariupol. Mariupol is the city which the has been encircled. It's the big remaining port city on the Sea of Azov. It's Ukraine's major steel producing city, and it's also a place where, if you believe what the Russians say, all the hardline Azov type forces are concentrated. And here, actually, the news is actually somewhat dramatic, because it seems that, somewhat to my surprise, the Russians and the militia forces are gaining ground much more quickly than most people had anticipated. I mean, most people, certainly I, had anticipated that this would be a tremendous life and death struggle, that the Azov people would put on a bitter and tough resistance. But the news, on the contrary, suggests that more and more districts of the city, which is a big but not an enormous place, have been captured, especially by the militia, and that these hardline groups and the Ukrainian military there are becoming increasingly bottled up into a small number of districts. Now, I'm sure that all of you heard reports yesterday about the attack on the kindergarten, hospital. I'm not going to spend any time discussing those. I mean, there's masses of amounts of allegations and claims. The original allegation came from the Ukrainians. Doesn't mean it's not true, but, it means that one side is saying it in a war. You've got to be careful. The Russians said it was fake news. Lavrov has said that this particular hospital isn't really anymore a hospital. It's the headquarters area of the Azov forces. I'm not going to go there. I mean, all I will say is this. I remember lots and lots and lots of reports during the Syrian war of hospitals being bombed. And when people went there and looked at this on the ground, it turned out that most of these allegations were either straightforwardly untrue or wildly exaggerated. So I'm not going to waste any more time on that. The key thing is that Mariupol is invested, it's encircled, and it's apparently about to fall. Now, the other thing that's happened is that there's been constant attempts to get these humanitarian corridors from the northern cities up and established. There's been very few people actually moving out of these cities along these corridors. There's much argument again and discussion as to who's responsible. Again, I'm not going there. For the record, I think it's much more likely that if there is any obstruction, it's coming from the Ukrainian side. Why would the Russians want to close humanitarian corridors, which they themselves have set up, when logically they would want the civilians to leave the cities, so that would make it easier for the Russians to occupy them without causing massive civilian injuries or deaths. So that suggests to me that, again, it's more likely that the Russians are telling the more reliable story there. But anyway, the humanitarian corridors are not fully working. Again, the experience of Syria, which is the place where this sort of thing was trialled before by the Russians, and also in Chechnya as well, by the way, suggests that these things never work immediately. They do, however, work eventually, when a decision is finally made by the besieged forces that they can't hold out indefinitely and that they have to go. And I would, by the way, in parentheses, thank the person who sent me that extremely interesting email, which gave an account of how similar tactics were used in the second siege of Grozny by the Russian army in the early 2000s. And it discusses, it's a very interesting article, which discusses very clearly how the Russians operate humanitarian corridors and how it fits together in an overall strategy to pacify a country rather than break it. So that it seems to me is the overall situation on the ground.
Real quick, how do they operate the corridors? If you can just say in like just a couple of minutes, some insight.
Yes, I mean,
How this works.
How this works. The key is to get the various UN agencies involved. So the UN agencies get involved eventually. They're usually very reluctant to become involved, but they do become involved. They then arrange collecting points in the cities. Buses come in, provided, by the way, by the Russians, and the buses then take the civilians out. And there's a lot of bitter anger because some of these civilians, most of these civilians in these northern cities would be taken to Russia, which after all is very nearby. It's just about 40, 50 kilometers away. So it's logical from a humanitarian relief a relief operation point of view to take them to Russia. But of course, understandably, perhaps the Ukrainians have been objecting. But the key to succeeding with humanitarian corridors is to get the UN relief agencies engaged and the Red Cross engaged. Now, of course, and this is also the pattern in Syria, the UN relief agencies are conflicted. Most of them are headed by Westerners who are to some extent responsive to their governments. The UN Secretariat is also heavily responsive to pressure from Western governments, as of course is the UN Secretary General, Mr. Guterres, who is of course from a NATO state, from Portugal. So there are always those problems. But at the end of the day, they also have functions, humanitarian functions. And in Syria, those ultimately won out, and I'm sure they will eventually in Ukraine too.
Right. And how do they separate the military guys that they want to disarm and get out of there? The ones that willingly want to disarm and get out
well,
of there. Are they also on the... I mean, if you know, are they bused somewhere else or just allowed to go home?
Right. If they are people from the conventional Ukrainian military, they can, if it's provided they don't get onto these coaches and things with arms, they're allowed to go home. And apparently some of them have indicated that they might be willing to do that. So there is that side of it. The more hardline Azov type battalions, it's more difficult. And this is where working with the UN agencies, the relief agencies, is important, and where the Russians will be on the ground, because of course they will want to filter these people to make sure that the people who do get evacuated are not these sort of people. By the way, it's not actually quite as difficult to identify who is an Azov type person as one might think. I say that I have no corroboration for what I'm about to say, but again, I've heard this from people who do know about this place, which is that many of them, as joining up with the Azov, one of the things they do, I say the Azov, it's a generic name for lots of different organizations, but apparently they all sport tattoos. It's part of the culture of these sort of organizations that you give yourself a tattoo. And that obviously makes you easy to identify if you look in the right place.
All right. Yeah. The humanitarian corridors are something that the Russians have implemented in Syria. You mentioned Grozny. We've talked about the encirclements and the cauldrons. Let's move over now to the negotiation side of things. We had the meeting with the foreign ministers of Ukraine and Russia in Turkey.
Yeah.
From what I understand, nothing really came out of that meeting substantive. But I think it's important for everyone to note that it has taken the Russians 8 years to get the Ukrainian government, whether we're talking about the Yatsenyuk government, or whether we're talking about the Poroshenko government, or whether we're talking about the Zelensky government. It has taken them 8 years to get any Ukraine government at a negotiating table. And they're now starting to sit down at the table. And I think that's the most significant development out of all of this, is that they finally have them at the negotiating table, something they could never do for 8 years. So anyway, what was happening in Turkey? What do you know about the meetings between the foreign ministers? And is there something that they agreed upon? Were there some points that they found in common?
They didn't agree on anything at all, and the meeting was very short, by relatively speaking. It was 90 minutes, which is, for a sit-down negotiation, I mean, that's hardly, on issues as complex as this, it's hardly anything, actually. I mean, the one thing I would say is that I'm assuming that the discussions took place in Russian. Every Ukrainian speaks Russian. So that would have meant that, 90-minute meeting between Lavrov and Kuleba would be the equivalent of an 180-minute meeting between Lavrov and some Western official. But having said that, there was no substantive agreement. But you're absolutely right. You've made the key point, which is that finally Ukraine is negotiating, and it's negotiating on Russian terms. Now, they're not agreeing to what the Russians are demanding, and that's inevitable. At this stage of the conflict, it would be astonishing if they did agree. But they've already basically said that they're prepared to look at neutrality. And the terms upon which they're talking about neutrality are apparently unacceptable to the Russians. I think Lavrov made it very clear that as far as he's concerned, the core Russian demands are now non-negotiable. But the very fact that the Ukrainians have come along, they're talking with the Russians, they're talking about the kind of things the Russians want them to talk about, is a sign from a Russian point of view of progress. And I think that, again, I'm going to repeat the point which I made in program after program, which is that for the Russians, it's a mistake to think that they're just looking for a military solution or a political solution. They're looking for both. They're looking for a comprehensive solution of the entire conflict in Ukraine. That means getting the Ukrainian government to essentially agree to their core demands. And Zakharova, who is the foreign ministry spokesman, spelled it out. She said they're not looking for regime change. They're not going to overthrow the government in Kiev. That's not what it's about. It's about getting that government reconstructed and at the same time negotiating seriously about Russian proposals. And that government is still struggling to do that. They're still hoping against hope that they'll be admitted into the European Union, tomorrow or the day after. Not happening. They're still hoping that they'll be able to find some way of getting the West to intervene. And we've had the ludicrous affair of the MiG-29 fighter jets in Poland, which I think we ought to touch on, because, that really is so farcical that it demonstrates how unserious, in many respects, Western policy towards Ukraine is. But, as the Ukrainians begin to realize that they are running out of options, I think that sooner or later they will face that decision where they either agree to the core Russian demands, in which case we will have a political settlement with a fair chance of peace in Ukraine, or eventually the Russian demands will start to escalate, as Putin said, in a way that is incompatible with the existence of Ukrainian statehood. Now, I just want to say on the second point, there's been a lot of discussion I've seen about what the response of average Ukrainians has been to the Russian advance. And many people have correctly pointed out that, that the Russians are not being greeted everywhere as liberators. People aren't coming out with flowers and bread and salt and all those things. And I don't think anybody who follows the situation expected that they would. But there has been no organized resistance to them from the civilian population. No sign of it. All of the places that the Russians and their militia allies have occupied have resumed peaceful life. There have been no strikes, no protests of any significance there. There have been a few scattered protests, but they've been fairly small. So it doesn't look as if people are prepared to come out and die for Ukraine. And contrast that with the film that we got out of Prague in 1968, when the Soviet army marched into Prague and millions of people came out onto the streets to protest their presence. There's been nothing like that in Ukraine. There might be eventually in one or two places. Conceivably, there will be protests in Kiev itself. And also, of course, in Western Ukraine, I suspect it would be very different. But in the places which the Russians have got to, at the present, we've seen nothing like that. So when the Russians tell the Ukrainians that the entire future of Ukrainian statehood is in jeopardy, then of course that is a real threat, because it looks as if it comes about that Ukraine, as we've known it, disappears, there's not going to be too many people in the places that the Russians control who are going to be too sufficiently angry about it to do anything about it.
Right. So, when Putin gives a warning like this, obviously, I think we've all learned that we should take his warnings very seriously.
Extremely seriously, yes.
So he will keep that warning, that promise or that warning. He will
Absolutely
stay true to it. So as this drags out, obviously the country that we know as Ukraine may not exist.
Exactly.
And the Russian military will escalate and ramp up the pressure on the ground in order to get the diplomatic solution that they want, which are those terms that they've, they're very transparent about what they want. They've laid it all out. So what worries me is that everyone understands Zelensky at this moment in time is playing a part. He's playing a role of the resistance hero. And much in the same way that the West, the collective West, goaded him, and not only him, I don't want to put all the blame on Zelensky as far as the whole NATO thing. I mean, they did the same thing to Poroshenko, and they did the same thing to the coup government that Nuland put in place as well, the Yatsenyuk government. And these guys,
they were putting pressure.
The collective West, they kept up.
Yeah, they were putting pressure on Yanukovych as well. I mean, people tend to forget this, but the man who was overthrown was also being put under a lot of pressure.
Yeah, so I mean, they've always been, saying, no, you're going to keep on saying you want to get into NATO, keep on saying you're going to want to get into NATO, don't back down. And every consecutive government in Ukraine has taken the same line. Yes, we want into NATO. Yes, we want into the EU, and yes, we want into NATO. But now it seems like they're goading or pressuring Zelensky, controlling Zelensky, I don't know, use whatever word you want, to play this resistance hero. And I guess as any dedicated actor would do, he is taking on the role. I mean, he's relishing in the role. I mean, he gave the speech in the UK Parliament the other day, and he's enjoying this his Churchill-like moment. It seems. What worries me is that he's playing a part, a role. He's acting, and the real decisions are made elsewhere. They're made with Kolomoisky, and they're made with the State Department, Nuland, her team, Nuland, Blinken, let's say that team over there. And you have Putin's warning.
Yes.
Let's find a solution. Let's wrap this up. Otherwise, the Ukraine we know today may not be there tomorrow.
Yes.
You have the fighter jets in Poland, which show that the United States, being led by Blinken, they're trying to figure out a way to prolong this insurgency, to create an insurgency and prolong it, to flood Ukraine with weapons. And with the testimony of Nuland with regards to the biolabs, perhaps once again get some sort of Syria type of chemical bio false flag in place like we saw, for example, in Duma. What worries me is that as the West runs out of options and Zelensky's just playing his resistance hero part, they're going to fall back on some sort of false flag as a final way to gain sympathy in the collective West so that they can get that no-fly zone, so that they can get the weapons and the fighter jets finally poured into Ukraine, so that they can get the Europeans, the Polish, the Germans to say, okay, we saw what happened with this bio attack. As Marco Rubio said, and Nuland said, it has to be the Russians, of course. So we're going to change our stance. with fighter jets, with no-fly zones, with whatever, and let's go all in. Do you see where I'm taking this?
I absolutely see where I'm taking. Can I just say,
they're creating a very dangerous and sinister
yeah,
way forward. All of these forces, Zelensky, Blinken's, Newland's, all of this stuff is very very dangerous.
It's extremely dangerous, and what makes it particularly dangerous is it's every part of it is part sinister and part farce. And if we turn first of all to Zelensky, I mean, there is that aspect about him as well, because on the one hand, as you correctly said, he comes up with these Churchillian speeches when he goes before a virtual thing before the UK House of Commons and all of those sort of things. He switches that on. Then, of course, when he has press conferences, you see him exhausted and looking awful and perhaps high. And he's rambling, he's incoherent, he's saying all kinds of things. Other moments when he has that interview with ABC, he's talking about, accepting neutrality. He's talking about negotiating the settlement of the status of Donbass and Crimea. So he doesn't stick to a consistent position. And he also, because very few people in the West see the entirety of him, but of course, in Russia and Ukraine they do. I think he can also look not just contradictory, but at times, frankly, ridiculous. And I don't like to say that about somebody who, at some level, I still feel sorry for, actually, because, as you correctly say, I don't think he's in control of the situation. But what it shows to me is the fact that he's saying one thing to one audience, something completely different to a different audience, sending his foreign minister to Turkey to talk to Lavrov, doing all these kind of things, is that there is a massive pull and push. He's caught between two enormous forces. On the one hand, there is the situation on the ground. There is the fact that Ukraine, the very survival of Ukraine now hangs by a thread. So he's got to worry about that. He's probably got people around him who are becoming extremely frightened. And at the same time, he's also got, so that perhaps leans him towards some kind of settlement. At the same time, he's also been pulled in the other direction. He's been pulled by, as you said, the hardliners in the State Department, those sort of people. And I have to say, I'm pretty sure people within his own entourage and his retinue who would prefer to go down fighting, because from their point of view, if they didn't, I mean, they could go down in a completely different way. So you have this push-pull situation. And by the way, I read a report somewhere. I've read so many reports, I can't even remember where it was. But I read a report that there is actually a special forces unit made up of SEALs and US Navy SEALs and presumably British SAS, who are waiting to spring him, the moment it looks as if he might fall under Russian control. And I suspect also that there is a lot of anger in Washington. I don't suspect it, I know there is, that there is a lot of anger towards him in Washington because of his decision to stay in Kiev. And the fact that he stayed in Kiev obviously has played a certain role in holding things together in Kiev, and it's also meant that it's more difficult for the Russians to set up some alternative political structure in Kiev itself. But it also means that from an American point of view, if he falls under Russian control, then setting up a government in exile or a government in Lviv is going to be much more difficult than it would be if Zelensky was heading it. Anyway, I've said a lot about Zelensky, but I agree. It's sinister and it's farcical at the same time. And you see that in Zelensky. You see that also with the MiG-29 thing. And the MiG-29 affair, to my mind, demonstrates yet again a fundamental truth about this crisis, which is that it's been driven overwhelmingly by the hardliners in Washington, in the State Department, by Blinken, by Newland, by all those sort of people. Now, they apparently, together with Josep Borrell, hatched this harebrained idea of getting Poland, Bulgaria, and Slovakia to donate Soviet-era fighter jets to Ukraine, presumably operating from Polish, Bulgarian, Romanian, Slovak bases to take on the Russians. And it's absolutely clear that the Pentagon wants to have absolutely nothing to do with this idea. But even though the Pentagon has repeatedly vetoed it because they see it as incredibly dangerous, and even though it's also obvious that the Polish government, of all governments, the most hard line, doesn't want to go there. They understand how dangerous that would be. There are still people like Blinken and Nuland, and I have to say Borrell, who was used, this is the EU External Affairs Commissioner, who was the first person to float this idea. They still want to push it in some weird way. So you're getting this extraordinary push and pull between the State Department, which wants to take the things as far as it possibly can, and the DOD, the Pentagon, who say, for God's sake, what are you doing? This is crazy stuff. We're not going to allow it. We're not going to have anything to do with it. And you see the pressure that countries like Poland are under, because the Poles, coming under all this pressure from the State Department, they say, look, we can't give the fighter jets directly to Ukraine. We'll give them to the US instead. The US can then decide what it's going to do with them. And then the Pentagon comes back and says, we don't want them. We want nothing to do with them at all. And again, it's part sinister, people looking to escalate this crisis and give it a military dimension, and part farcical, with nobody being able to decide what to do with these fighter jets, and this whole crazy idea going round and round in circles, in a way, by the way, that the media in Britain has, I mean, they're very embarrassed by it because, I mean, they've reported it in all sorts of crazy ways. And you see this also in the sanctions war, where, again, you have Blinken pushing for an outright embargo on Russian oil right across the entire collective West. And you see now splits starting to emerge, with the Germans starting to say, no, we're not going there. And Borrell today, by the way, just made a speech in which he said that financial sanctions against Russia have gone as far as they can, which appears to rule out any further idea of de-SWIFTing the 70% of the Russian banking system that is still connected to SWIFT, including Sberbank. So you can see that there is this push and pull. And of course, when you have that, it's very dangerous. Things can always escalate out of control. It makes it extremely difficult for Zelensky to make kind of meaningful concessions. And on top of all of that, you have now this really scary, very worrying, very embarrassing story about the biolabs. And that whole conversation between Rubio and Nuland seemed to me to be setting up the scenario for a Russian chemical attack in Ukraine. And you also had reports that, US officials were talking about the Russians using nuclear weapons against a Ukrainian city. I mean, crazy stuff. And somehow Nuland, and it's difficult to know exactly what it was, but she went off script in a way that maybe she was just tired. I mean, one doesn't quite understand what happened. But again, it's farcical because you see Nuland going off script, admitting to the fact that these biolabs exist, something that the US has never admitted to up to now. And at the same time, it's sinister because you see both Nuland and Rubio were talking about a chemical attack, a Russian chemical attack. So this is a very dangerous situation because when it's both farcical and sinister at the same time, what that tells you is that the people who are running with this thing aren't in full control of what they're doing. They haven't sorted out all the various angles. They're pushing all the time to take the most extreme solutions. And they're becoming almost desperate about the need to take these extreme solutions. And of course, if it doesn't work out the way they want, given how committed and invested they are in this whole enterprise. The risk is that they're going to do something unbelievably reckless and incredibly stupid.
Yeah, and this is what happens in the United States as well when you have a president who is not in control either. You have the State Department pushing one direction, you have the Pentagon pushing it another, and I'm sure there's a lot of capable people in the Pentagon from the military side of things who are saying, this is crazy. We need to de-escalate, but you have these Blinkens and these Newlands who are ideologues, and they're just hell bent on regime change in Russia. They've got Russia in their head 24 hours a day,
Absolutely.
and they want to escalate. And my worry is after watching that exchange between Rubio and Newland, which I believe was 100% scripted,
Absolutely.
without a shadow of a doubt, they're laying the groundwork for this attack. In very much the same way that we saw it play out in Syria with Assad.
Yes.
Assad must go, and as Assad was winning the war, sure enough, with each victory, you had some sort of chemical attack, and Ivanka Trump, taking the pictures to President Trump, and Nikki Haley holding up the photos, all of that stuff.
Yes.
They're laying the groundwork for it, and what you just described.